Welcome to the Lou Blakely Show. You're in the right place if you're a service provider who is ready to transition into a more freedom-based business model with digital products. In this podcast, I share with you a unique combination of launch strategy, energetics, and mindset to create true, long-lasting success. It's time to ditch the burnout for good, create the business that you truly want, and share it with the world. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to this very special episode of The Lou Blakely Show. This is episode 42. So today I'm making a big announcement about the future of this show. In this episode, I'll be revealing the new name for this podcast and sharing a little bit of background about why I'm changing it. So it's episode 42. 42 episodes feels like massive, but then at the same time, like I'm only just getting started. You know, like when I started this episode or this podcast, I didn't really understand how much a podcast, how big of an impact it can have on you as a person, but also how much work it takes. Like there's a lot of work involved with creating a podcast. And I feel like that I wanted to create a podcast for years. Like it was something on the back of my mind. And then when I ended up doing it really, really quickly. I just decided now's the time, get it out there. And based on I actually had purchased a course from Pat Flynn, which I followed to get my podcast launched and out there. And one thing that was really clear to me from that course was starting the podcast is just one thing, right? It's just the launch. The real work for a podcast actually comes after that. And he talked a lot about pod fade and said that the average amount of podcasts on the internet or, you know, in the directories have an average of 7 episodes. And I was like, wow, that is crazy. So my goal when I started this podcast was to not be that person that started a podcast, put that effort into the launch and then just bailed. So that's always been my goal up until now. But as I'm getting more in the swing of things, and like I'm talking, like I have been podcasting now for over a year. So it's at this point where I'm really thinking, well, how can I not only keep going with this because I'm loving it, even though it's a lot of work, and how can I actually shift into a new gear? So that's why I'm changing the name, and I'm going to share what that name is. So when I first started this podcast, I was really racking my brain for a name. Like I would have to say that naming things is not a strength of mine. And, you know, I come from a digital marketing background. Some of you who have been following me or listening to these episodes know that I used to actually even have a course on SEO. So like that kind of keyword focused naming has always been something that I've focused on, but it didn't really feel right, or I couldn't think of the right name when it came to creating this podcast. And I really didn't want to just continue to go round and round in circles around what the name was any longer. Like I was no longer prepared to do that. And I just wanted to get started. So I decided I'm just going to call the podcast after myself, The Lou Blakely Show. I'm just going to go for it. I'm just going to start. I'm going to get in the flow of it. I'm going to learn about podcasting. And I know that the name will probably change. So the fact that this name is changing is no surprise to me because I always knew that at some point it was going to change. It was almost just like a placeholder. And I didn't really want to name it after myself, but at the time there was no real clear alternative to me. So I just decided to imperfectly jump into podcasting. I did everything myself. I did hire someone to create the intro and outro. But apart from that, I did everything myself, including the images, all of that stuff. And I actually went from no podcast to podcast within a couple of weeks. And I definitely recommend that. But the name wasn't perfect, but that's why I'm changing it. So why am I changing it apart from that? Apart from the fact that I don't want to have a podcast named after myself. It's not that I don't want to, but The reality is I am here in this business helping women create amazing online businesses because I want to really create an impact on as many women as possible. I'm not famous. Like, people don't know my name. So a podcast named after myself is not useful for getting found. And yes, I want a lot more people to listen to this podcast. I want this podcast to grow. So I have decided to shift the name away from naming it after myself to a name that is based on common keyword search terms. So yes, my SEO background is coming back. I also believe that we are in a really interesting time in the online space with online business. It's changing rapidly. It is still not the norm in the wider society, but I think that now there's so many more people in this space. So I think we need to, act a bit differently or look at ways that we can really continue to stand out. And what necessarily worked a few years ago in terms, like I'm talking about names here, is not really going to work as things evolve, because the reality is you can have the coolest name in the world, but if no one can find you, then it's not really going to be worth the effort, right? I also believe that as this online space gets louder, that being more specific in our marketing and drilling down even further into a niche is actually going to help us stand out amongst all of the noise online, right? And I know that this is a big struggle for course creators, for anyone in their online business space, is how to actually stand out. And I believe one way that you can do that is to get even more specific about who you're helping. I also think that people get really, really, really hung up on names. I see it all the time where they're like, they've got all these plans and they want to move forward with them, but the name is keeping them stuck. And to be honest, it's something that has really held me back, possibly more than anything else. I think that there's nothing wrong with a really clear and easy name over something clever, but sometimes we're like, we want the really clever name that everyone loves. The reality is that this isn't going to sell your course if you're naming a course, right? Or if it's a podcast, it's not going to automatically make people find it. And I think getting found when you are creating content is actually the most important thing. I also do believe that giving something a name in order to move forward is actually a really good strategy, and it's exactly what I've done with this podcast. Imagine if I had not decided to name this podcast The Lou Blakely Show in order to move forward, and I was still now, a year and like 3 or 4 months later, still wondering what to call it. I would not have got to 42 episodes. I would not have gained the knowledge that I have from this podcast, because honestly, this podcast has taught me so much about myself, and it has actually allowed me to become a lot better at speaking and all of that kind of stuff. So there's other effects of a podcast than just people listening to it, like for a way to market your business, if that makes sense. So if that's you and you can't think of a name, just pick a name and move on. You can always change it later. And as I've found out recently, it's actually really, really, really easy to change a podcast name. Now, something else, and this has been huge for me this year, is I am looking at ways that I can create ease in my business where I actually get more benefits for essentially doing the same amount of work. And, with this name, I think that as part of that, I want more people to listen to this podcast, but continually grinding and promoting it and hustling and all that stuff just does not work for me at all. It's not even an option. Like, I can be consistent in showing up and sharing the podcast, but I literally am not going to spend hours a day promoting it. It's just not something I want to do. So thinking smarter, how can I actually bring more people in to find it without me actually doing any more, is by using SEO and keywords that people are already searching for to get found. Less effort for me, but more people finding me. And this is something I'll be doing more of going forward, definitely. So you can say that I am actually falling back in love with SEO, which I find so funny. I am fully ready to embrace SEO again, especially if it is going to help me get found by more people so I can create more impact. So that's a big part of this podcast name change. So the content in the podcast is actually going to be the same. I'll be sharing actionable tips about not only starting, but also growing a successful online course-based business. I'll also be sharing the mindset and the energetics that I believe is such a huge part of this. Like, none of that is going away. I'm still going to be sharing the same kind of content. It is simply the name that is changing. So it's time to introduce the new name of the podcast. The podcast name is changing from The Lou Blakely Show, and it is now going to be called The Online Course Creator Show. So today I am going to be changing the cover art. And from now going forward, when you see the podcast, maybe on my Instagram or anywhere else online, you are going to see the new name. But everything else is staying the same, like the content's staying the same, the look of the graphics is staying the same. So it is simply a name change, and that is all. As you can see, the name is very keyword driven, and my plan is that this is going to impact the number of people that can listen to this podcast, and that is my main goal. I am here to share my knowledge with the world, and I'm really ready to step up into a much bigger game when it comes to that. So that is why I've changed the podcast name. I hope you love it. I hope you keep listening. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure that you go to the little plus sign up the top in Apple Podcasts and subscribe to the show, because I've got lots of cool content coming out. Starting off with tomorrow, I've got a guest interview on the show. I have special guest Natalie Tolhoff, who is a sales expert. It's a great interview, so I definitely recommend that you tune into that tomorrow. So thanks for listening today. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the new name. And if you haven't already, make sure that you do subscribe to the show so that you can tune in to the episodes moving forward. Have a great day, and I'll be back tomorrow with that guest interview. Thanks, course creators and go-getters. You're incredible, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you haven't done so already, make sure you hit subscribe in your podcast app so you don't miss an episode. If you'd like to find out more about what I offer, head across to loublakely.com. See you next time.